Do you want to know all the secrets when it comes to ink blending? I got you covered. Come on, let's go.
Hey everybody, it's Justin Adkins from Just a Note by Justin, and I am so excited to be here on the Scrapbook.com YouTube channel today, sharing a special ink blending 101 video tutorial with you all. I am going to be going over the ins and outs of ink blending, hitting some tips and tricks so you can get those nice seamless blends and perfectly blended die cut edges. So come on, let's get into some details. For this video, we are going to be focusing on the Distress Inks and Distress Oxide ink products by Tim Holtz for Ranger ink for the rest of this video. Distress inks are your standard dye inks, and Distress Oxide inks are actually considered a special hybrid containing properties of both dye inks and pigment inks. I thought it would be a good idea to compare these inks side by side. So I've gone ahead and prepared a swatch where we're going to compare the Candied Apple Distress ink to the Distress Oxide ink. Now for the portion of this video, I will be using the ink blending tools with domed foam applicators from Scrapbook.com. Now I've gone ahead, I am going to get my foam nice and saturated with the Candied Apple Distress ink. I like to dab off a little bit of an excess as this prevents any immediate smudging, and I am going to begin just blending from the center right to show you this Distress ink color with the Candied Apple. Because dye inks sink into your paper, you are going to get a very bright and very vibrant sort of feel from these Distress inks. Because they're dye inks, they don't necessarily blend the best in comparison to Oxide inks, but we're going to get into that in a little later. I'm using a clean foam applicator for my Oxide ink to prevent any sort of cross-contamination, and I'm repeating the process of getting my foam nice and saturated and dabbing off the excess. You can immediately tell on the glass mat the difference between the Distress ink and the Oxide ink because there's almost like an opaque cloudiness when it comes to the Oxide, where the dye is a little bit more translucent. So I'm blending this onto the paper, and you're going to see that the Oxide ink does have a more cleaner blend to it. So I've gone ahead and compared both of the items together. So we've got the Distress ink right here compared to the Oxide. You can see the difference in vibrancy. You can see the difference in blending as well. Let's repeat the same process by using some mustard seed Distress ink and Distress Oxide ink. I'm going to pull in some clean foam applicator tools for this as well, one for the Distress ink, one for the Oxide ink, and I'm going to repeat the process of blending directly onto the paper. Dab off a little bit of the excess and just begin to blend next to the section. A lot of times, swatching your inks is a great idea, especially using different mediums so you can see what it looks like on the paper you're intending. Here you can see that mustard seed Distress ink is very vibrant, and now we're going to use a clean foam blending applicator, like I said, not to get any sort of cross-contamination going, saturating that ink pad, and then we're going to dab off the excess and begin to ink blend onto our panel. Notice how that Distress ink has a nice big dark spot in the center and the Oxide ink doesn't. It just blends a little more nicely because that Oxide ink sits on your paper longer than the Distress ink does. So it's really noticeable with this mustard seed swatch that we're doing to see the difference of the two. Let's finish off with our third swatch, and we're going to use Salty Ocean Distress ink and Oxide ink. Once again, I am pulling in some new foam applicator tools, and I'm going to start using the Salty Ocean Distress ink and applying it right to paper. Now, I know I've used clean foam for each of these applications, and that's because it's really hard to use these applicators in different color family groups. If I took that yellow applicator and applied it with the Salty Ocean, following the rules of color, it's going to make my ink pad and my color green. So once again, we're going to use another clean foam applicator, getting the Salty Ocean Oxide ink so we don't have any sort of cross-contamination. Like I had said before, you are going to want to use two different tools for your distress inks and your oxide inks because they are not the same ink quality. And here you see how we have both the distress ink and the oxide ink and how they compare with each other. The distress ink definitely is more vibrant. It's got more smudginess to it, where the distress oxide ink is a little bit more opaque, but it's so much more smooth. That means it's going to work really nicely for blending, especially when it comes to backgrounds. We've got our three main swatches done, so these are great items to sort of tuck away into your stash so you can compare them on future crafting instances. I love these three primary colors for the distress inks and oxide inks and definitely think they are worthwhile to add to your collection. Now we did some swatching on white cardstock. Let's see what happens when we pull in some black mixed media paper by Scrapbook.com. I'm going to use the Salty Ocean Distress Ink first, dab off a little bit of excess, and start to blend it right onto the black mixed media paper. To be honest, you're not going to see much. It just looks like a wet spot on the paper. You might see a little bit of a blue tinge to it, but distress ink does not do well on colored papers. Now you're going to find though that oxides are an entirely different story. So when I begin to ink up my distress onto the mixed media paper, you can fully see that it's blue. It sits really nicely on top of that dark cardstock, and what this shows you is that the qualities of the distress oxide ink work, that you can ink blend on top of any sort of a color paper and still get those colors to show through nicely. So keep that in your back pocket when you're thinking about different effects you can do for your next project. Types of paper is really important when it comes to ink blending. I grabbed a piece of cardstock from my stash. This is just kind of standard white cardstock that I got from a big box retail store that I actually use for organizing my stamp pockets. I want to show you why quality of paper matters, and it's going to really show when it comes to the distress ink. I start to blend the distress ink on top of my paper, and you will see immediately that the way that my paper is treated, it doesn't allow that distress ink to properly sink into that paper. It just sort of sits on top, and you can move the ink around and get these swirl marks. Now, if that's the sort of pattern you're looking for, no big deal. This might be the paper for you. Now, with the oxide inks, this paper does end up being smooth enough that my oxide ink works nicely with it, but off camera I did try to blend it with another color and it didn't blend very smoothly. So don't think that when it comes to paper, you can use just whatever is in your stash. Now let's talk about three different types of papers that are going to work nicely for your ink blending. I grabbed some Scrapbook.com mixed media paper in white, and I'm going to begin by testing out some Candied Apple Distress ink. I do the same thing I've done with my other swatches, and I begin to put the ink onto the paper. It blends fairly nicely. It's got a little bit of that swirl pattern that we talked about the previous paper, but not that much, and the ink moves very nicely onto the paper. Now with the oxide ink, you're going to see that it's going to work beautifully for this as well. I've gone ahead and I've added the oxide ink onto the paper, and I'm getting close to what I would feel like is almost a perfect ink blended circle. It's blending so nicely on there, and I just think that this is a definite paper to keep in mind that you may be able to do some ink blending with. Now another paper that's going to work really nicely for your ink blending is Distress Heavy Stock. This paper is also pretty smooth. You can't find paper too much more smooth than this. You can start by blending Distress ink right onto it, and it starts to kind of seep into the paper. I use Distress Heavy Stock a lot. It's built to withstand some ink use. I use it for sprays often and when I don't want to use the watercolor paper, and I like how it functions. I also use it for the Distress Oxide ink, and you're going to see how that oxide ink works really nicely on top of it as well. I love these oxide inks. When you have a nice blending tool with oxide inks, those inks really blend like butter. Now, lastly, I'm pulling in the Neenah Classic Crest Solar White. This is the 110-pound cardstock. And this is actually my personal favorite of the three that we're working with today. So I am pulling this in, and I'm going to once again use the distress ink to do a sample onto the paper. I really like how it holds the distress ink for blending. It really absorbs the ink nicely and allows that bright, vibrant color of the distress to really shine through. Then again, when we pull in the oxide inks and dab off a little bit of the excess, you get a really nice blend of that as well. So I hope that this demonstration of these three types of paper show you that not every paper is built equally, and there are some special types of paper out there for you to consider. Now, while paper may be one component of your blending journey, your tool that you use is going to be a huge component as well. So I'm pulling in two different craft tools right here. This is that domed foam applicator from Scrapbook.com, and the other is the foam blending tool by Ranger Ink. I like to use both of these with my crafting, but there's different instances that are going to make the most sense. So I have two blending tools to use with my oxide ink, and I'm not going to cross-contaminate them with my distress ink. These are going to be oxide ink only, not used interchangeably, because I don't want to get the components of the ink mixed onto the different pads. I use the mini ink blending tool with the mini ink blending foam from Ranger Ink, and this gets me really nice broad areas of blending. However, I'm not really able to use the edges of the brush to get into nooks and crevices. It's really just when you want to apply that flat pressure to the paper. Now, pulling in that domed foam blending tool with the foam by Scrapbook.com, I get that same sort of blending, but because of the shape of the foam, I'm able to maneuver my domed foam applicator in ways to kind of add my hand on an angle and really get into some of the nooks and crannies. This is great to keep in mind when you're applying it on stencils. I think that the domed foam does really well when you want to move your hand around a lot. However, the regular mini ink blending foam from Ranger Ink, I think works really well when you just want to apply ink along a large, broad surface. So there's definitely different instances of what you may want to use these tools for. So it's worth investing in both of them. Foam is not something that's super expensive on the craft market, and it's easily something you're able to try out. Now let's talk about some blending brushes, because blending brushes are a different way that you can apply ink to your project. Now, blending brushes aren't going to give you a really dark sort of blend right immediately. You really have to build up that ink blending. As you can see, it starts really light on my paper. And that, if that's an effect that you're going for, these blending brushes are going to work really nicely for that, because you can shift how much pressure you want to apply. It starts off really soft, and it works really nicely when you want to carefully blend the edge of something but not fully divulge it into an entirely new color. It takes a lot of more effort, in my opinion, to use the blending brushes, so I don't reach for them often. Personally, I also think using blending brushes with oxides can get a little cumbersome at times when it comes to cleaning them. I think the distress inks, because of the ink quality, works a lot better with the brushes. While I do typically recommend with the foam that you should have at least one color per foam, I think that with the blending brushes, you can get away with one brush per color family. Now, Scrapbook.com does also have some of these smaller blending brushes that you can use for your ink blending as well. I heavily discourage you from trying to use these small brushes to blend up an entire background, but what they're going to work perfectly with is getting those small little detailed areas, and I've prepared a little bit of a tutorial for you to show exactly what I'm talking about. I grabbed a piece of that Nina Classic Crest Solar White cardstock, and I placed the geometric snowflake stencil directly on top. I'm going to use that small detail blending brush to blend each of the small polka dots with this stencil. This is a great way if you don't want to have to keep taking your stencil off, cleaning it, and reapplying it to your paper. That big brush also doesn't work well because these dots are pretty small. So the small brush really works nicely for this purpose. So I've gone in, I'm blending up all of the little polka dots to the best that I can, and then I'm going to be able to move on to a new color using that Salty Ocean Distress Oxide ink, using a new brush because I don't want to cross-contaminate against color families, even though they're both oxide inks. And I am using this other brush to blend up some of the snowflakes. Because of how small the brushes are, they really allow me to keep these colors separate and to just blend up the designated shapes that I want. So most of the time when I use these smaller brushes, I am using them on stencils when they're able to let me do a new and fun technique. While I am using a lot of oxide inks in this video, I'm also pulling in some distress inks because I like to use distress inks when it comes to blending on the edges of my die cuts. I've pulled in some mustard seed distress ink to use with this stitched balloon die from Scrapbook.com, and I go in and I use the domed foam applicator to blend the edges of the balloon. This gives you that sort of 3D effect with the balloon because you've got that nice shading on the edges, and I just think that it adds that extra finish touch for your project. I'm going to wipe my surface clean and then move on with a new Distress Ink blue blending foam to work with the Salty Ocean color. Now, like I said, I do typically recommend, because how inexpensive the foam is, it doesn't hurt to have a foam color designated per color of ink. You could potentially get away with just doing one per color family, but usually when it comes to the investment, you don't have to buy too many blending foams to have one foam per color. You don't necessarily have to have a whole brand new tool, while that would make your life easier, but usually at least one foam. So here you can see that yellow balloon with the distressed edges, and I've got the blue one with the distressed edges as well, just to add that nice sort of ink blended effect. Now, I think one of the things that people like the most about oxide inks is the ability to blend up backgrounds. So I am going to be placing some of that Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 110-pound paper on a paper inking palette. This one is by Picket Fence Studios, and we're going to do just a simple light to dark orange blend using oxide inks. I'm using the regular mini foam applicator tools by Ranger Ink for this tutorial. I'm going to start with some dried marigold. And what I'm going to do is, on the top of this panel, just using circular motions, I'm going to apply pressure so that I can get this ink color onto my panel. Just going back and forth, building up my color the best as possible, leaving the bottom edge just slightly sort of frayed out so that'll go for good blending. Now, I'm using a new blending foam. It is on a new blending tool to use the Carved Pumpkin Distress Oxide ink, which we're going to blend directly next to the marigold. Now, I am going to push and pull the colors, and I'll explain a little bit more as we're getting into it, but I am going to push some of that Carved Pumpkin Distress Oxide ink into the dried marigold area. And then I'm going to take my dried marigold blending foam and I'm going to then pull that Distress Oxide Carved Pumpkin into the Distress Oxide dried marigold, but use the ink on the dried marigold to sort of blend it out together. And it's a lot of pushing and pulling back and forth because you want to layer up those colors nicely so that they are going to give you that nice ombre effect. Now don't worry, I'll explain it a little bit further if you didn't catch it the first time. So we're going to use some crackling campfire on the bottom of our panel, and that crackling campfire is going to blend into the carved pumpkin. We're going to make sure that that carved pumpkin and that crackling campfire meet, and I want that area where they meet to be as seamless as possible. So after I'm done with the crackling campfire and I pushed it into the carved pumpkin, I'm then going to use my carved pumpkin blending tool to pull some of that crackling campfire Distress Oxide ink into the carved pumpkin color and just keep working circular motions to blend them into each other. I alternate back and forth until I get a finished product that I like, and here you see my orange ombre panel that I can use for any sort of crafting that I want. How about we do another tutorial of how to do your ink blended backgrounds, and let's make this one purple. So I'm pulling in Shaded Lilac, Wilted Violet, and Villainous Potion Distress Oxide inks, and these will be the colors that we work on for our 3-color ombre background. So this might sound a little repetitive, but it's always worth going over just so I can answer any questions. I'm going to start with that Shaded Lilac color on top because it is the lightest. You can add it to the bottom if you want. It just depends if you like to work from light to dark, up to down, whatever your preference is in terms of ordering of colors, because the truth is I could flip this around and it would be the reverse order, but it's the same thing. Once that shaded lilac is all laid down, I'm going to use my new mini foam blending tool to put the Wilted Violet Distress Oxide ink next to that shaded lilac on my panel. I'm blending it very nicely. I'm pushing that wilted violet into the shaded lilac so that it'll be able to be blended very nicely into the color, and I'm making sure to fill about the center third of the panel. Now going back to that shaded lilac blending tool, I'm going to pull that wilted violet a little bit more into the shaded lilac area, but it's going to begin the process of really blending those two colors together. And like I had said, if you're not super happy with how the blend is going, add a little bit more ink to your blending tool and add it because it's going to help and aid the process. Now, being transparent, there are some times where you can add too much ink to a paper and you may start to see it build up. You may get a little bit of a residue from that, so just be a little bit mindful, but experiment. See what the limits are with the paper that you're using, and you'll get the knack of it really quickly. So lastly, we're going to put down that Villainous Potion on the very bottom of the paper. Truthfully, this is one of my favorite Distress Oxide colors, so I'm very excited to be using it for this panel. So I'm going to add it to the bottom of the panel, very close to the Wilted Violet color, and then occupying the bottom third of the panel and getting a nice solid coverage. I really like how this mini ink blending foam works in terms of getting a really nice coverage onto the paper. It does a fantastic job with it. So once I'm satisfied with how much Villainous Potion is on the panel, I grab my Wilted Violet blending tool and I begin to pull that Villainous Potion into the Wilted Violet area to work on getting that nice ombre blend. I just sort of keep on blending until I'm very happy with it. I add a little bit more of that Wilted Violet ink to my blending tool so that I get a really nice seamless blend. And you just kind of keep working back and forth. You want to minimize any sort of harsh lines. Go back and forth with the different blending tool colors to help get those lines blended out. As you can see, I'm going back even with that shaded lilac because I want to make sure all my lines are accounted for. And I have my purple background panel all situated. I just love how these colors look, but I have a little bit more to share with you. Now, what's a tips and tricks video if I don't give you a tip of some of my favorite blends? And this one is fun because it's a shortcut. And I'm going to show you how you can use 3 colors to get a perfectly rainbow ombre of 5 different colors on the color wheel. Now, I'm using a little bit of mint tape to secure the back of my Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 110-pound cardstock to my glass mat. That's 4-inch tape. You can easily use the 1-inch tape. I just grabbed what was on my desk. Now I am using that Candied Apple Distress Oxide ink as a top layer for my quick rainbow. Now if you haven't noticed already, this is sped up to 2 times as fast just because it does take a little bit of time with the ink blending, and I didn't think you needed to sit through me talking through all of it. Next we're going to add some mustard seed, and you're going to see as I'm pushing that mustard seed into the candied apple, what do you get? You get a little bit of that orange. Because you're blending these 2 colors together, it does follow the laws of the color rules, and you do get a nice sort of orange area. We're going to add some Salty Ocean to the panel, and this is also going to create a green portion on our panel as well. You're almost using this as a hack because you don't have to get the different orange and green inks to make this sort of a rainbow, and you can use those 3 tools to push and pull the colors into each other to get this nice rainbow ombre. I love little tips like this that really sort of stretch your stash to the max, and I think that this rainbow ombre looks really nicely as a background. Now, another fun thing about Distress Oxide inks and Distress inks themselves is they're water reactive, so I'm spritzing a little bit of water on top of it, and you're going to see those nice bleach marks that pull up. Now, I do like to dry off my panel, so I use a cloth to clean it up, and look at that. That's a really fun way to add to your panel. I'm pulling in my paper inking palette from Picket Fence Studios to blend up my next favorite blend. Now, this is to show you what it's going to look like if you wanted to blend up a background that's a rainbow background, but actually use 6 different colors to do so and not really cheating the system like we did with the previous card. So I'm pulling in some Candied Apple Distress Oxide ink first, adding that to the top of my panel. But now I'm going to show you something that I haven't done yet, and I'm going to add some wilted violet, but to the bottom of my panel. And the reason that I'm putting it on the bottom of my panel first is I want to make sure that each of my colors has its own designated space and that it's spaced out accordingly. I don't need too much candied apple, but not enough wilted violet that I run out at the bottom, so I begin alternating back and forth. You'll start seeing now that I'm adding some of that carved pumpkin to the top with that candied apple and blending them into each other. Now I'm going to go to the bottom and use that salty ocean and blend that into the wilted violet color. Like I said, just kind of going back and forth, making sure that each of the color is occupying as about even amount of space as possible. In time, if you go from top to bottom long enough, you'll understand what I'm talking about, that when you get to the bottom, you kind of feel like you're running out of space and there's not too much space for that final color. So this is a really good way to make sure that each of the colors is getting its appropriate spotlight on your project. Using the mustard seed Distress Oxide ink, I'm going to blend that into the carved pumpkin Distress Oxide and just going back and forth with the different foam blending tools. You'll also catch that I've switched to the dome foam blending tools just because I like to show a little bit of variety, and these are also doing a fantastic job when it comes to blending as well. The final color that we're going to be using is the mowed lawn. The only interesting thing though that's different about this is I'm going to have to push and pull this into 2 different colors. I'm going to have to push it into the mustard seed and the salty ocean to get that nice blend. So I go back and forth with each of the tools using the salty ocean to pull in that mowed lawn color, and then I'm going to, once that is all completed, use my mustard seed blending tool so that I could go ahead and pull the mowed lawn into that mustard seed as well. Don't be afraid of needing to add more ink to your blending tool to get those blends that you're looking for, because the goal is to get them to look as seamless as possible. So here you have it. We have our non-hack version of a rainbow ombre, and I wanted to just compare them side by side so you could see the different effects. Now, one of my favorite things to do with ink blending is a night sky blend, and we're going to start by adding one of my favorite Distress Oxide colors, which is Salvage Patina. So we'll start with adding Salvage Patina to the bottom of my panel, and then we're going to go a little darker with some peacock feathers, and we're going to blend the 2 colors into each other. These sit pretty close to each other on the Distress Oxide color wheel and blend into each other rather easily. I'm going to then pull in some Uncharted Mariner that I'm going to blend into the peacock feathers, and this is where that darkness of the night sky is really going to start to play effect. So I'm pulling in and pushing with the 2 different blending tools, and I just really like these different steps of color. It's going to get even darker though, which is what I love about this blend. Next, let's pull in some Chipped Sapphire. Chipped Sapphire Distress Oxide ink is kind of a sleeper hit when it comes to your oxides. It might not be a color you think you need right away, but when you see what it can do to your night skies, it's going to be a must-have. So this is definitely on my must-have color list, and I think that you'll get a lot of use out of Chipped Sapphire. Finally, we're going to pull in for our oxides Distress Oxide ink, and I'm going to blend directly on top to get that nice sky blend. It's going to add that dark night sky color right on top, and then I just sort of push and pull into each other. After I'm done blending, I'm going to do something that might go against what I've told you about before, and I'm actually on the top going to pull in some Black Soot Distress ink because it is going to be darker than that oxide. I'm going to use it on a new blending tool and just sort of add it on top to make it a little bit darker. You can add Distress ink on top of your oxide inks. It's not going to contaminate anything, and it works really nicely. Let's do a little bit of those splatter marks with water, and it's going to give you those really nice bleach spots. We'll go ahead and also pick up the paper as well with a cloth, get it nice and dry. And another thing you can do with your paddles is you can do some splattering. I'm bringing in some of the chipped sapphire distress oxide ink, smushing it down and wetting it with some water. I take a clean watercolor brush and then I'm able to splatter the wet ink on top of my panel. It sets really nicely. I think oxides work better than distress inks because they don't spread out much after you spread them, or splatter them rather, and it's something that you can do to really make your project look pretty. Now, after you splatter with an ink, you can also add another media, like I'm using the Liquid Gold Paper Splatter Watercolor by Picket Fence Studio. My thought process with this is, with using gold on top of a night sky blend, they're going to look like little stars in the sky. So I'm splattering that liquid gold paper splatter onto the paper, and I just love how it looks. It's going to dry up so nicely, and I'm totally excited to use this for a fun nighttime themed project. You'll get a closer look at those metallic stars, and I love that blend. For another blend, I thought that it would be fun to kind of tap into some autumnal vibes because it is my favorite season of the year. I'm going to use Scattered Straw, Carved Pumpkin, Barn Door, Seedless Preserves, and Villainous Potion for this next blend. We're going to start by adding some Scattered Straw to the bottom of the panel, and I'm actually using rules of the color wheel to blend these colors into each other. Let's call Scattered Straw my yellow. Maybe not a true yellow, but it's going to be my yellow. And yellow sits right next to orange. So I am going to blend my carved pumpkin color directly into my scattered straw. I'm pushing and pulling those colors with my blending tool so that they go really nicely into each other for my blend. Next to orange on the color wheel is red, so I'm going to use Barn Door next to my orange. It's going to blend more seamlessly that way as opposed to skipping to other colors. I'm going to go back and forth between the different blending tools I've already had to make sure that my seam is nice and seamless. Let's go with Seedless Preserves next because it's a warm violet sort of color, so it sits next to red on the color wheel. I'm going to use my Barn Door blending tool to pull in that Seedless Preserves color, and it's really starting to have that nice autumnal feel to it. Now lastly, we're going to use Villainous Potion. It's got a little bit more blue in it than Seedless Preserves, but it does still sit next to a violet on the color wheel, so it's going to blend the nicest into that Seedless Preserves color. So I'm going to go back and forth with the different tools, pulling in that Seedless Preserves blending tool so that I'm able to blend the items very nicely on the panel. I go back in with Barn Door just to make sure I'm getting that blend going, do a little bit with the carved pumpkin as well, and finishing off with that scattered straw. Not only does this blend give you perfect autumnal vibes, but it also is a great sunset blend as well. It's super pretty and great for so many occasions. The last blend I wanted to share with you is something I'm calling beachy vibes, and we're going to use saltwater taffy, wild honey, squeezed lemonade, cracked pistachio, and peacock feathers to get this blend. We're going to start by using saltwater taffy for the blend, and we'll start on the top of the page. Saltwater taffy is a fantastic peach color that if you like to lean into not starkly pink, but like to have a little bit of that peachy warmth to it, this is going to be the color that works for you. Wild honey is also another favorite of mine because it's a lot more yellow than the packaging looks, and it's got a lot more vibrance. So I'm pushing and pulling the two colors next to each other because pink sits pretty close to orange and yellow on the color wheel. Next, we're going to use some squeezed lemonade. It blends really nicely into that wild honey color. It's just actually a little lighter in color, so you're kind of doing a step down of color. I use the tools back and forth to get that blend, and I think this is starting to look really pretty. This color almost reminds me of a beach sunrise because of how bright and pastel the colors are. I think that this would also be a fantastic color palette if you, I don't know, if you were decorating a beach home or something like that. I pull in some cracked pistachio because this is a color that I almost consider like a seafoam color when it comes to the oxides, and I like how it sits next to the squeezed lemonade. I use the tools to push and pull them back into each other so that we get a nice blend between this yellow squeezed lemonade and the greenish blue of the cracked pistachio. Finally, we're going to use some peacock feathers for the bottom of the cracked pistachio. You also could pull in salvage patina as well, and it would blend really nicely, but I like the deepness of the peacock feathers because it kind of reminds me of the ocean. We're going to blend it with that cracked pistachio to get a nice blend between the two colors, and then just sort of go back with a little bit of that squeezed lemonade so that I can get a more seamless blend. Don't be afraid about adding a little bit more ink if you want to work on those blends because it will help ease those lines. I'm going to splatter some water onto this panel as well, just because I think it's going to add some fun bleach marks that we can use to our advantage for the project. Now I do go ahead and pull in some opaque white liquid paper splatter from Picket Fence Studios, and this is going to just add some extra detail to that background. Rule of thumb, add some splatters if you think you have some harsh lines. It will help distract from it in the final project. I love this beachy vibe blend so much, and I had so much fun creating it. I wanted to share a little bit of inspiration as to how you can use these backgrounds. And I did use 3 of the backgrounds to create some really fun projects using some Scrapbook.com products that I really love. Now you can use different techniques just as the whole panel is a background or die cutting elements. I used the Joyful Wishes stamp set to create this card with 2 of the rainbow panels we blended. I also used the Geosquares cover die for my background. For our second card, I used our Night Sky blend with the Stars stencil with some Yellow Jacket lunar paste as well. Lastly, I pulled in the Autumn Vibes panel. I used the Mum stencil with 3 colors of Astro paste, and I also used the Pumpkin Spice stamp and die set to make an autumnal sweets themed card. Now, of course, the fun won't stop there. I've got some fun other panels that we created during today's tutorial that I'm going to be able to save for a future project. And that's all, friends. I hope that you loved today's Ink Blending 101 class because I had so much fun teaching it to you. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I would love if you took a moment to follow me on social media. You can find me on Instagram at JustinNoteByJustin and on YouTube with the same handle as well. Now, lastly, always remember, for the best selection, fast shipping, and free inspiration, Scrapbook.com has you covered. I can't wait to create with you again very soon. Goodbye.